The tent flaps whipped in the Wyoming wind as Grace Sutton crushed dried valerian root with her mortar and pestle. Her fingers stained purple from pokeweed tinctures, and her heart heavy with the weight of another 18-hour day. 3 months. She had been running her apothecary from this canvas shelter on the outskirts of Wallace, Wyoming. And 3 months she had watched the town's residents eye her with equal parts suspicion and grudging need, coming to her only when the nearest doctor was 2 days away, and their children burned with fever or their wounds festered beyond prayer. It was late afternoon in August 1876, and the summer heat made the tent feel like a furnace despite the shade cloth she had rigged overhead. Grace wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, careful not to contaminate the preparation she was working on for old Mrs. Henderson's arthritis. The woman had hobbled in yesterday, skeptical but desperate, and Grace had promised her relief within a week if she followed the regimen exactly. "Miss Sutton," a tentative voice called from outside the tent. Grace looked up to see a young mother she recognized from the general store, a squalling infant in her arms and panic written across her sunburned face. "Please, my baby. She won't stop crying and her skin is so hot." Grace was already on her feet, hands outstretched. "Bring her here, quickly. Lay her on the table." The examination took only moments. Fever, yes, but not dangerously high. The real culprit was the angry red rash blooming across the infant's belly and back. Heat rash, worsened by the wool blanket the mother had wrapped her in, trying to comfort her. "She needs to cool down," Grace said gently, already mixing a paste of oatmeal and chamomile. "This heat is too much for her delicate skin. Use cotton if you have it and bathe her in lukewarm water 3 times a day. Apply this paste after each bath." The young mother's eyes filled with tears of relief. "How much do I owe you?" Grace glanced at the woman's worn dress, the way her own cheeks were hollow with hunger. "A dozen eggs when your hens are laying well again. I hear they have been suffering in this heat too." After the woman left, clutching the jar of paste like it was gold, Grace returned to her work. But her concentration was broken by the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a purposeful pace. She stepped to the tent opening and watched as 4 riders approached, dust billowing behind them. The man in the lead sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, all lean muscle and quiet confidence. He wore a dark hat pulled low against the sun, and even from a distance Grace could see the glint of a badge on his chest. A lawman, then. Her stomach tightened with old wariness. The riders stopped a respectful distance from her tent, and the lead man dismounted with fluid grace. As he approached, Grace got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features tanned dark by sun and wind, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of sage in summer. There was a hardness to him, the kind that came from seeing too much too young, but also something else she could not quite name. "Miss Sutton," his voice was low and rough like gravel underfoot. "That is me." Grace lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "What can I do for the law today?" Something flickered in those sage-colored eyes. "Amusement, perhaps. Name is Blake Holloway. I am deputy here in Wallace, working under Sheriff Morrison. These are my men." He gestured to the 3 riders behind him who had remained mounted. "Got one with a bullet wound that needs tending. Doc Patterson is off dealing with a mining accident up in Silver Creek. Won't be back for 3 days minimum." Grace was already moving, professional instinct overriding everything else. "Bring him in. How long ago was he shot?" 2 hours, maybe 3. "We had a run-in with cattle rustlers up near the northern pass." The wounded man was helped off his horse by his companions, and Grace directed them to lay him on the sturdy examination table she had constructed from pine boards and sawhorses. The bullet had caught him in the upper arm, passing through the fleshy part without hitting bone. Lucky, but he had lost blood and the wound was dirty. "I will need to clean this thoroughly," Grace said, already heating water on her small camp stove. "It is going to hurt." The wounded man, barely more than a boy really, nodded with gritted teeth. Blake Holloway stood just inside the tent entrance, watching her work with an intensity that made Grace's skin prickle with awareness. She ignored it, focusing on her patient. She had trained under her father, a physician who had believed his daughter deserved the same education as any son, back in Boston before consumption had taken him 2 years ago. Her mother had passed when Grace was still a child, leaving just the two of them against the world. The tent fell silent except for the occasional hiss of pain from her patient as Grace cleaned, disinfected, and bandaged the wound. She worked with swift competence, her hands steady even when she could feel Blake's gaze following her every movement. "Change the dressing twice daily," she instructed when she was finished. "Keep it clean and dry. If you see red streaks spreading from the wound or if fever sets in, come back immediately. That will mean infection and we will need to take stronger measures." "How much?" Blake asked, reaching for the coins at his belt. Grace calculated quickly. $3 for the treatment, 2 more for the bandages and medicine you will need for the next week." He paid without question, counting out $5 and placing them in her palm. His fingers brushed hers, rough and warm, and Grace pulled back as if burned. "Thank you, Miss Sutton." Blake's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You did good work here." After they left, Grace sank onto her stool, suddenly exhausted, but there was no time to rest. A rancher arrived needing a poultice for his infected hand. Then a woman wanting a tonic for her husband's persistent cough. Then a child with a badly scraped knee, accompanied by a grandmother who eyed Grace's remedies with the superstitious wariness of someone who still half believed in hexes and curses. Darkness was falling when Grace finally allowed herself to stop working. She ate a cold supper of bread and cheese, too tired to light a fire, and lay down on her bedroll in the back section of the tent she had partitioned off for privacy. Through the canvas, she could hear the sounds of Wallace settling in for the night. Piano music from the saloons on Main Street, the occasional shout or burst of laughter, the lonely whistle of the train that ran through twice a day. She had come to Wyoming because opportunity lived in the wild places, or so she had believed. Boston had no room for a woman physician, not really. The male doctors had made that clear when she had tried to establish a practice there. Out here, she had thought, where life was hard and doctors were scarce, maybe her skills would matter more than her gender. But even in Wallace, she faced resistance. The town had been slow to trust her, slow to accept that a woman could know anything about healing. And so she worked from a tent on the edge of respectability, proving herself one patient at a time. Sleep came fitfully, full of dreams she could not quite remember when dawn woke her. The next day brought more of the same grinding work, but also something unexpected. Blake Holloway returned, this time alone and without any injured men in tow. Grace was grinding dried mint leaves when his shadow fell across her workspace. She looked up, startled, and found him standing with his hat in his hands. "Deputy Holloway, is your man all right?" "He is fine. Wound is healing clean, thanks to you." Blake shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I actually came to talk to you about something else." Grace set down her mortar and pestle, giving him her full attention. "All right. I have been watching how hard you work out here," Blake began. "Seen how many people come to you for help, even if they won't always admit it in public, and I have been thinking. There is a building on Main Street for you." Grace stared at him, not quite believing she had heard correctly. "I am sorry, what? A building? On Main Street?" Blake spoke more firmly now, warming to his subject. It used to be a land office, but the fellow who ran it moved on to Cheyenne 6 months ago. Been sitting empty since then. It has got a good stove, glass windows, a back room you could use for living quarters, real walls and a real roof. I cannot afford a building on Main Street, Grace said flatly, though her heart had begun to hammer with a hope she was afraid to acknowledge. I am barely scraping by as it is. The town owns the building now, Blake said. Landlord abandoned it when he left. Sheriff Morrison and I have been talking to the town council, and we think we can convince them to let you have it for minimal rent. Maybe even free for the first few months, until you get established. Grace's throat tightened with emotion she refused to show. Why would you do that? Blake met her eyes directly. Because Wallace needs a healer, and you are a damn good one, even if half the town is too stubborn to see it yet. Because I have watched you save lives from a tent with dirt floors and canvas walls, and I keep thinking what you could do with proper facilities. And because, he paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face, because you deserve better than this. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Grace was not quite ready to examine. I will need to see the building, she said finally. Blake's face broke into a smile that transformed him, chasing away the hardness and revealing the man beneath the deputy's badge. I was hoping you would say that. Can you spare an hour now? Grace looked around her tent, at the patients who might come. But it was mid-morning, typically a slow time. All right. They walked through Wallace together, and Grace was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them. A single woman walking with a man, even a lawman, was enough to set tongues wagging. But Grace had long ago stopped caring what narrow minds thought of her. Main Street was the heart of Wallace, a wide dirt thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to project permanence in a place where nothing lasted long. The general store, the assay office, 3 saloons, a hotel, the sheriff's office, a dressmaker, a barber, a livery stable. And there, tucked between the general store and a building that advertised itself as a boarding house, stood a narrow 2-story structure with faded paint and dusty windows. Blake produced a key and unlocked the door. It swung open with a creak, and Grace stepped inside. The space was larger than she had expected, perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 deep. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the front windows. The walls were real wood, the floor solid planks instead of dirt. At the back was a pot-bellied stove, and a doorway that led to a smaller back room and a narrow staircase climbing to the 2nd floor. Upstairs is just one big room, Blake said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. But it has got a window facing east, catches the morning sun. Back room down here could be for storage, or for patients who need to rest after treatment. Grace walked slowly through the space, her mind already rearranging it. A counter here for preparing medicines. Shelves along that wall for her growing collection of herbs and compounds. The examination table near the window for best light. A waiting area with chairs near the front. It is perfect, she whispered. Blake had followed her, and now stood close enough that she could smell horse and leather and something else, something uniquely him. So you will take it, if the town council truly agrees. Grace turned to face him and found him closer than she had realized. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. But why are you really doing this, Deputy Holloway? Blake, he said. Please call me Blake. Blake, she amended, tasting his name on her tongue and finding she liked it. He was quiet for a long moment, and Grace watched emotions chase across his face like clouds across the sun. I lost my mother when I was 12, he said finally. Fever took her, fast and mean. Closest doctor was 3 days away, and by the time he got there, she was gone. I have always wondered if someone skilled had been closer, if things might have been different. And then you showed up here, and I saw you save that Henderson baby everyone thought was going to die, and I thought, maybe I can help make sure other kids do not lose their mothers because healing is too far away. Grace's eyes burned with tears. She blinked away. I am sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago. But the grief in his voice said otherwise. Point is, you are good at what you do. You should not have to do it from a tent. I will talk to the town council, Grace said. And thank you, Blake. This means more than I can say. Walking back to her tent, Grace felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider. Blake Holloway was a complication she had not anticipated, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness and eyes that saw her as more than just a woman out of place. The town council meeting was held 2 nights later in the back room of the largest saloon. Grace arrived dressed in her best gown, a dark blue wool that was too hot for summer but projected the respectability she needed to sway doubters. Blake was already there, standing at the back of the room with Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled man in his 50s who looked at Grace with speculative interest. There were 8 men on the council, representing the major businesses and land holdings in Wallace. Grace recognized most of them by sight. Mr. Patterson, who ran the general store, Mr. Chen, who owned the largest restaurant, Mr. Kowalski from the livery, others whose names she was less certain of. The meeting was called to order, and Blake stepped forward to make his case. He spoke eloquently about the need for consistent medical care in Wallace, about the lives already saved by Miss Sutton's skills, about the opportunity to establish their town as a place where people could count on healing when they needed it. Then, it was Grace's turn. She stood before these men who held her future in their hands and spoke from her heart. She talked about her training, her experience, her commitment to serving everyone regardless of their ability to pay. She did not beg or plead, but neither did she hide her passion for her work. Wallace is growing, she said. Every month brings new families, new businesses, new opportunities. But growth means nothing if people cannot stay healthy enough to enjoy it. I want to help build something lasting here. I want to be part of this community, not just someone working from its edges. Give me the chance to prove what I can do with proper facilities, and I promise you will not regret it. The council members looked at each other, exchanging glances that Grace could not read. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. How much rent were you thinking to charge, Ed? He asked the chairman. Ed Thornton, who owned the hotel, tapped his fingers on the table. Well now, that is the question. Building has been sitting empty, costing us money in property tax. Maybe we start with $30 a month, see how things go. Grace's heart sank. $30 was more than she could afford, not with all her other expenses. Blake spoke up before she could. With respect, Ed, Miss Sutton is just getting established. She has been working out of a tent, for crying out loud. What if we say $10 a month for the first 6 months, then renegotiate based on how the practice is doing? That is barely covering costs, someone objected. True, Sheriff Morrison rumbled, speaking for the first time. But Blake has got a point. We want Miss Sutton to succeed, not to struggle so hard she gives up and moves on. Town like Wallace needs a healer. Mine accidents, riding accidents, children falling ill, women needing help with birthing. Doc Patterson is good when he is around, but he is spread too thin across 3 counties. Having someone here permanent that is worth some investment. The debate went on for another 20 minutes, but Grace could feel the tide turning in her favor. Blake's reputation carried weight, and the sheriff's support even more so. Finally, a vote was called. 7 ayes, 1 nay. The building was hers. Grace felt dizzy with relief and joy. She thanked the council members, shook hands, accepted congratulations, and somehow made it outside into the cool night air without breaking down in tears. Blake was beside her instantly. "Congratulations," he said, and his smile was brilliant even in the darkness. "I cannot believe it," Grace breathed. "I have a building, a real building." "You deserve it," Blake's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "When do you want to start moving in?" "Tomorrow," Grace said immediately, then laughed at her own eagerness. "I mean, if that is not too soon, I will need to clean to set things up properly." "I will help," Blake offered. "And I can probably round up a few other hands too, make quick work of it." Grace looked at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she had not known how to form. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Blake stepped closer, and in the moonlight his eyes were dark and intense. "Maybe I will tell you someday. But for now, let me just say that I like seeing you happy. It suits you." Before Grace could respond, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the street with her heart racing and questions tangling in her mind. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Blake was as good as his word, showing up at dawn with 3 other men to help Grace move her belongings and supplies from tent to building. They carried her heavy table, her shelves, her boxes of herbs and medicines. They swept and scrubbed and chased away 6 months of dust and neglect. Grace worked alongside them, refusing to be just an observer in her own transition. Her hands grew blistered from scrubbing, her back ached from lifting, and she had never been happier. Blake was there through all of it, working tirelessly, and somehow always appearing at her elbow when she needed something heavy moved or a shelf hung higher than she could reach. They fell into an easy partnership, anticipating each other's needs, working in companionable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. "Where did you learn medicine?" Blake asked on the second day, as they arranged her bottles and jars on the newly installed shelves. "My father taught me," Grace said, carefully placing her laudanum in a locked cabinet. "He was a physician in Boston, trained at Harvard. He believed women were just as capable as men of understanding science and medicine, which was a radical notion to most of his colleagues." "Sounds like he was a smart man." "He was brilliant." Grace's voice softened with memory. "He died 2 years ago, consumption. I tried everything to save him, every treatment I knew, but nothing worked. That is when I decided to come west. Too many memories in Boston, too many closed doors. I thought out here maybe I could make a difference." Blake was quiet for a moment. "You are making a difference. You saved Tommy Henderson. You have treated dozens of people who would have gone without care otherwise. Your father would be proud." Grace had to blink away sudden tears. "Thank you for saying that." By the 3rd day, the transformation was complete. The building that had stood dusty and abandoned now gleamed with purpose. Grace's sign, hand-painted by the town sign-maker, hung above the door. "Grace Sutton, Apothecary and Healing." Inside, everything had its place. The front room was organized and welcoming, with chairs for waiting patients and a small table with recent newspapers. The examination area offered privacy with a folding screen Grace had acquired from the general store. Upstairs, her living quarters were modest but comfortable, more space than she had enjoyed since leaving Boston. "What do you think?" Grace asked Blake, who stood surveying their work with satisfaction. "I think you are going to do great things here," he said simply. That night, Grace slept in a real bed for the first time in months, surrounded by real walls, and dreamed of possibilities. Word spread quickly through Wallace that the tent healer had moved to Main Street, and Grace's patient load increased almost immediately. People who had been reluctant to walk out to the edge of town for care now stopped by her shop between other errands. Women brought their children in for minor ailments that could become major if left untreated. Men came in sheepishly with injuries they had been ignoring. Grace threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She established regular hours, posted them on her door, and made a point of being available for emergencies any time, day or night. She began keeping detailed records of her patients and their treatments, building a base of knowledge about the common ailments in this part of Wyoming. Blake stopped by often, always with some official reason, checking on the wounded deputy, whose arm was healing well, bringing in other men with various injuries sustained in the line of duty. But Grace noticed that his visits often stretched longer than necessary, that he found reasons to linger and talk. She found herself looking forward to his arrivals, listening for his distinctive footstep on the boardwalk outside her door. They talked about everything and nothing. Blake told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about learning to ride before he could walk, about how he had drifted into law work after his father lost the ranch in a bad year, and his parents died within months of each other. Grace talked about Boston, about her unconventional education, about the books she missed having access to. "There is a lending library in Cheyenne," Blake mentioned one afternoon. "If you ever want to make the trip, I would be happy to escort you. It is not safe for a woman to travel alone." "I would like that," Grace said, and meant it. The trip to Cheyenne happened 3 weeks later. Blake arranged for a Saturday when Sheriff Morrison could spare him, and they took the early morning train together. The journey took most of the day, the locomotive chugging through landscape that alternated between stark beauty and crushing emptiness. They talked for hours, easy and comfortable in a way Grace had never experienced with a man before. Blake told her about the outlaws he had tracked, the dangerous situations he had survived, but also about his hopes for the future. He wanted to be sheriff someday, to help bring real law and order to Wyoming territory. He wanted to see towns like Wallace grow into real communities where families could thrive. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you want, Grace?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I want to be respected for my skills," she said slowly. "I want to save lives. I want to build something permanent, something that matters." She hesitated, then added, "And I want to belong somewhere. I have been rootless since my father died, just drifting. I want to feel like I have a home." Blake's sage-colored eyes were intent on her face. "Do you think Wallace could be that home?" "Maybe," Grace said softly. "I am starting to think it could be." The lending library in Cheyenne was a revelation, 3 rooms packed with more books than Grace had seen since leaving Boston. She wandered the aisles in wonder, pulling volumes at random, feeling their weight in her hands like old friends. Blake followed patiently, offering observations about titles he recognized and asking questions about ones he did not. Grace borrowed 4 books, the maximum allowed, including a new medical text that had just arrived from New York. Blake carried them for her as they explored Cheyenne, walking down streets that were wider and more established than Wallace's rough thoroughfares. They had dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths and real silver, an extravagance that made Grace protest until Blake insisted. "Consider it a celebration," he said. "Your first month on Main Street. You have earned something special." The meal was delicious, but what Grace enjoyed most was the conversation, the way Blake looked at her across the table like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. They talked until the restaurant began closing around them, and even then, neither wanted the evening to end. On the train ride back to Wallace, Grace fell asleep with her head on Blake's shoulder. She woke as they were pulling into the station, disoriented and embarrassed, but Blake just smiled down at her with such gentleness that her heart turned over in her chest. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I did not mean to use you as a pillow." "I did not mind," Blake said, and something in his voice made Grace look up sharply. The expression on his face was unguarded for once, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Longing, hope, fear, all tangled together in a way she recognized because she felt the same churning of emotions. "Blake," she began, not sure what she meant to say. "I know," he said quietly. "Me too." They did not speak more about it that night, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since the day he first walked into her tent. Autumn came to Wyoming territory in a rush of gold and crimson, the aspens turning brilliant against the darker pines. The air grew crisp and cool, a relief after summer's heat. Grace's practice continued to grow, and with it her reputation in Wallace. She was no longer the tent healer on the edge of town, but Miss Sutton the apothecary, a fixture on Main Street. Blake's visits became a regular part of her routine. He would stop by most evenings after his rounds, ostensibly to check that everything was secure, but really just to talk. Sometimes they sat in her shop, Grace working on preparations while Blake told her about his day. Other times they walked through Wallace together, Blake pointing out changes in the town, introducing her to people she had not yet met. People began to notice, of course. Grace heard the whispers, saw the speculative looks. Blake Holloway courting the lady apothecary. She should probably have been more careful of her reputation, but she found she did not care. Blake made her happy in a way nothing else did, and after so many years of loneliness, she was not willing to give that up for propriety's sake. It was late October when the mine accident happened. Grace was closing up shop for the day when she heard the commotion in the street, men shouting and running toward the edge of town where the Silver Star mine operated. Her stomach dropped. Mine accidents were every frontier community's nightmare. She grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the noise. Blake appeared beside her, matching her pace. "Collapse in one of the shafts," he said grimly. "They are bringing out wounded now." The scene at the mine was chaos. Dust still hung in the air, and men were carrying out injured miners on improvised stretchers. Grace did rapid triage, directing the most seriously injured to her shop and sending others to wait outside. There were too many for her to handle alone. She worked through the night, Blake at her side helping hold patients still for stitching, fetching supplies, assisting with everything from cleaning wounds to mixing medicines. He never flinched, even when the injuries were gruesome, never questioned her decisions, just supported her however she needed. By dawn, Grace had treated 15 men. 2 had injuries severe enough that she insisted they be transported to the doctor in Silver Creek, despite the distance. 3 more she kept in her shop for observation, turning her back storage room into an impromptu infirmary. The rest she bandaged and dosed and sent home with strict instructions. When it was finally over, Grace sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. She was covered in blood and dust, exhausted beyond measure, but everyone had survived. That was what mattered. Blake knelt in front of her chair, his hands gently removing the bloody apron she wore. "You were amazing," he said. "You saved lives tonight, Grace." "We saved lives," she corrected, looking up to meet his eyes. "I could not have done it without you. I just did what you told me to do." "No, you did more than that. You were calm when others panicked. You knew what I needed before I asked. You." She trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. Blake reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. "Grace Sutton, you are the bravest, most capable woman I have ever known, and I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw and terrifying. Grace stared at him, her heart thundering in her chest. "I know I should not say it," Blake continued, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "I know you probably do not feel the same way, and that is fine. I just needed you to know. You are extraordinary, and watching you work tonight, seeing how you fought for every one of those men, I could not hold it in anymore." "Blake," Grace whispered, "I am falling in love with you too." His eyes widened with shock, then blazed with joy. "You are?" "I am," she confirmed, smiling despite her exhaustion. "I tried not to. I told myself I needed to focus on building my practice, that I did not have room in my life for anything else. But you kept showing up, kept being kind and supportive and seeing me for who I am, and I could not help it." "I love you." Blake surged forward and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Grace kissed him back, threading her fingers through his hair, tasting dust and hope and new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "What do we do now?" Grace asked. "Well," Blake said, his voice taking on a teasing note. "Traditionally, when two people are in love, they court properly. I take you to dinner. I meet your family, except you do not have any, and you have already met mine, such as it is. We spend time together and let everyone in town gossip about us. And then, if things work out, I ask you to marry me." Grace's breath caught. "Is that what you want?" "Marriage." Blake grew serious again. "Eventually, if you do. I am not trying to rush you, Grace. I know your work is important, and I would never ask you to give it up. But yes, someday I want to marry you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to support your dreams and build a life with you, if that is what you want too." "It is," Grace said, certainty settling into her bones. "I want that too." They courted properly after that, though half of Wallace already considered them as good as engaged. Blake took Grace to dinner every Sunday, the one day they could both usually spare time. They walked out together in the evenings when weather permitted. Blake began keeping spare clothes at Grace's building when he got called to help with emergencies, and Grace started packing him lunches to take on patrol. Winter came early and hard that year, snow blanketing Wallace by mid-November. Grace's practice shifted to treating colds and flu, frostbite, and winter accidents. Blake worried about her working too hard, wearing herself down, but Grace thrived on the challenges. It was Christmas Eve when Blake proposed, snow falling softly outside while they sat by the stove in Grace's shop. He had brought her a present wrapped in brown paper, and when she opened it, she found a leather-bound medical journal, rare and expensive. "Blake, this is too much," she protested. "Open it," he said softly. Grace did, and found an inscription on the inside cover in Blake's careful handwriting. "For Grace, who heals bodies and hearts with equal skill. All my love, Blake." She looked up with tears in her eyes to find Blake kneeling beside her chair, a simple gold ring held between his fingers. "Grace Sutton, will you marry me?" he asked. "I promise to support your work, to stand beside you through whatever comes, to love you for the rest of my life. You do not have to give up anything. Keep your shop, keep your name if you want, just let me be your partner in everything." "Yes," Grace said through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." The ring fit perfectly, a simple gold band that caught the lamplight. Blake kissed her deeply, and Grace felt happiness bloom in her chest like spring flowers. They were married in February, a small ceremony in the church on the edge of Wallace with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress of ivory silk she had ordered from Cheyenne, and Blake wore a new black suit that made him look devastatingly handsome. Sheriff Morrison stood up as Blake's best man, and Mrs. Henderson, whose baby Grace had saved, served as her matron of honor. Grace kept her shop, and Blake continued working as deputy, but now they shared the rooms above the apothecary. They fell into a rhythm of domestic life that felt natural and right. Blake would rise early to make coffee while Grace got ready for the day. They would eat breakfast together, talking about their plans. Then Blake would head out on patrol while Grace opened her shop. Evenings were theirs, precious hours when they could shut out the world and just be together. Sometimes they read aloud to each other from Grace's growing collection of books. Sometimes they talked about their days, sharing stories and seeking advice. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, Blake mending tack or cleaning his guns while Grace prepared medicines, content in each other's presence. And at night, in the privacy of their room, they came together with passion and tenderness, learning each other's bodies, expressing in touch what words could not convey. Grace had never been happier. She had found not just a place to belong, but a person to belong with. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. A family of homesteaders arrived in Wallace with a pregnant woman near her time. Grace attended the birth, a long and difficult labor that ended with a healthy baby girl and a grateful mother. Blake paced outside the door through the whole thing, making Grace smile when she finally emerged, exhausted but triumphant, to tell him mother and child were fine. "You are going to be impossible when it is our turn," she teased. Blake pulled her close. "Are we going to have a turn?" "Someday," Grace said, surprising herself with how much she wanted it. "When the practice is more established, when we have more help, I would like to have children with you." "I would like that too," Blake murmured against her hair. Summer brought a new doctor to the region, a young man fresh from medical school who set up practice in Silver Creek. He made a point of visiting Grace, and to her surprise and pleasure, treated her as a colleague rather than a curiosity. Dr. Richard Weber was impressed with her knowledge and her setup, and suggested they consult on difficult cases. "It is rare to find someone with your training out here," he said. "Most frontier healers are working purely from folk knowledge, which can be valuable but limited. You actually understand anatomy and physiology." "My father insisted on a thorough education," Grace said, warmed by the respect in the young doctor's voice. "Well, Wallace is lucky to have you. I hope we can work together." The collaboration with Dr. Weber opened new opportunities. Grace gained access to medical supplies through his contacts. They shared knowledge and discussed challenging cases. When a severe influenza outbreak hit the region that fall, they worked together to coordinate care across multiple towns, and their combined efforts saved countless lives. Blake watched his wife's confidence and reputation grow with fierce pride. She was no longer just accepted in Wallace but genuinely valued, her opinion sought on matters of public health and sanitation. When the town council discussed putting in a proper sewage system, they asked Grace to speak about the health benefits. When the school board debated whether to close during a measles outbreak, Grace advised them on quarantine procedures. 2 years after their wedding, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Blake. When she finally shared the news over dinner one evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Joy, wonder, and a hint of terror all chased across his face. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "In about 6 months," Grace confirmed, smiling at his expression. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right. I am terrified and thrilled, and I cannot believe this is real." Blake came around the table and knelt beside her chair, placing his hand gently on her still flat belly. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I already love you so much." Grace ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed with love for this man who had given her so much. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace continued working through the first months, but as she grew larger and more tired, she had to reduce her hours. She trained a young woman named Sarah Collins to assist her, teaching her basic first aid and how to prepare common remedies. Sarah was eager to learn and grateful for the opportunity. and Grace found she enjoyed passing on her knowledge. Blake became increasingly protective as Grace's due date approached, fussing over her in ways that were both endearing and exasperating. He insisted she rest more, worked himself to exhaustion taking over household tasks, and drove her slightly crazy with his constant concern. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Grace told him one evening when he tried to carry her up the stairs. "I know I am sorry. I just want to keep you safe." Grace softened, seeing the genuine worry in his eyes. "I am safe. We are both safe. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my woman, not my baby." Grace kissed him gently. "I love you for worrying, but you need to trust that I know my own body and my own limits." Blake tried to be less overbearing after that, though Grace could see it cost him effort. She went into labor on a bright morning in April, 3 years to the month since Blake had first told her about the building on Main Street. The contractions started mild and built slowly, giving Grace time to prepare. She sent Blake to fetch Dr. Weber from Silver Creek, knowing he would make better time than anyone else, and that keeping Blake busy would help him stay calm. Sarah stayed with her, following Grace's instructions as the labor progressed. Mrs. Henderson came too, having delivered 6 children of her own, and possessing the calm competence of experience. Dr. Weber arrived in time to oversee the final stages, but it was mostly Grace who managed her own delivery, guiding Sarah through what to do, staying focused even through the pain. And when her son was finally born, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Grace held him against her chest and wept with joy. Blake returned to find his wife exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle. "It is a boy," Grace said softly. "We have a son." Blake approached slowly, almost reverently, and Grace placed their baby in his arms. She watched her husband's face transform as he looked down at their child, saw tears stream down his cheeks. "He is perfect," Blake whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly over the months, never quite settling on one. But now, holding their son, Grace knew. "Joseph." "For my father. Joseph Blake Holloway." "Joseph," Blake repeated, testing it. "Joey, I like it. Hello, Joey. Welcome to the world, son." Grace had thought she understood happiness before, but nothing compared to watching Blake with their baby. He was a natural father, gentle and patient and completely besotted. He would spend hours just holding Joey, talking to him in a soft voice, marveling at tiny fingers and toes. For 2 months, Grace stepped back from the apothecary entirely, focusing on recovering and caring for Joey. Sarah managed the shop under Dr. Weber's occasional supervision, and proved more capable than Grace had even hoped. When Grace finally returned to work part-time, she did so knowing her practice was in good hands. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier but richer. Grace juggled motherhood and medicine, learning to nurse Joey between patients and catch sleep whenever possible. Blake adjusted his patrol schedule to be home more, and Sheriff Morrison, now in his 60s, began talking about retirement and recommending Blake as his replacement. "You would make an excellent sheriff," Grace told Blake one evening as they watched Joey sleep in his cradle. "It would mean more responsibility, longer hours sometimes. It would also mean you could shape how law is enforced in Wallace, make this town even better. I think you should do it." Blake did put his name forward, and when Sheriff Morrison officially retired 6 months later, Blake was appointed to replace him. Grace was bursting with pride at the ceremony, their son on her hip, watching her husband take his oath. The years flowed past like water, each one bringing changes and growth. Joey grew from baby to toddler to little boy, bright and curious and blessed with his mother's scientific mind and his father's steady nature. Grace's practice flourished, and she hired Sarah on permanently, training her in more advanced techniques. Blake proved to be a fair and effective sheriff, respected by the law-abiding and feared by outlaws. When Joey was 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, red-haired and fierce even from the first. They named her Alina after Blake's mother, and watched their family grow complete. Wallace grew too, evolving from a rough frontier town to an established community. The railroad expanded, bringing more commerce and more people. Buildings went up along Main Street, some of brick now instead of just wood. A proper school was built, and a new church, and a town hall for meetings and social events. Through it all, Grace and Blake remained at the heart of Wallace. Grace's Apothecary became an institution, the place everyone went when they needed healing. Blake kept the peace and upheld the law, earning a reputation that extended far beyond their small town. Together they raised their children, supported their community, and loved each other with a depth that only grew with time. There were hard times too, of course. Years when drought threatened the ranches and mines closed and money was tight. Times when sickness swept through, and Grace worked herself to exhaustion trying to save everyone, grieving the ones she could not. Blake had close calls in his work, came home wounded more than once, and Grace lived with the constant low-level fear that someday he might not come home at all. But they weathered every storm together, their love the anchor that held them steady. Joey grew into a thoughtful young man fascinated by law, talking about following his father's footsteps. Alina was all fire and determination, announcing at age 8 that she was going to be a doctor like her mother, but a real one with a degree, and no one doubted she would do exactly that. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Blake took Grace back to Cheyenne for the first time since their courtship. They stayed in the finest hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and visited the library that had so delighted Grace years ago. But what Grace treasured most was the quiet evening in their hotel room, Blake holding her close, talking about everything they had built together. "You remember that first day I came to your tent?" Blake asked. "You were covered in purple stains, exhausted but so determined." "I remember thinking you were trouble," Grace said with a laugh. "A handsome lawman who looked at me like I mattered." "You did matter. You still do. Grace, you have made my life better in every possible way. I knew within a week of meeting you that I wanted to spend forever with you, and every year since has proven me right." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me a home when I was rootless. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. You loved me when I did not know how much I needed to be loved. You are my partner, my best friend, my great love. Everything good in my life traces back to the day you walked into that tent and told me there was a building on Main Street for me." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion of enduring romance, and Grace felt grateful for every choice that had led her here. The years continued to pass. Joey at 18 was appointed deputy under his father, starting his career in law enforcement with Blake's guidance. Alina at 16 was already corresponding with medical schools back east, determined to get the formal education her mother had never had access to. Grace turned 40 and found herself looking at a life that exceeded every dream she had harbored as a young woman working from a tent. Her practice was thriving, now housed in a larger building Blake had helped her move to when Joey was 5. She had 2 qualified assistants, Sarah and a young man named Thomas Chen, who had been orphaned young and shown aptitude for healing. She was respected throughout the territory, consulted by other healers and doctors, invited to speak at medical conferences. Blake at 42 was in his prime. his hair showing threads of silver but his body still strong from years of physical work. He had brought real stability to Wallace, his combination of fairness and firmness making their town one of the safest in Wyoming territory. There was talk of him running for territorial marshal, though he was not sure he wanted to leave Wallace. "Whatever you decide, I will support you," Grace told him. "Though selfishly, I like having you close." "I like being close to you," Blake said. "I think I will stay right where I am." They were sitting on the porch of their home, a proper house now instead of rooms above a shop, watching the sun set over Wallace's Main Street. 17 years since Grace had arrived in that tent. 15 years since they had married. A lifetime of moments that added up to a love story Grace would not change for anything. "You ever regret it?" Blake asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, giving up the chance to practice in a big city, ending up in a small Wyoming town?" Grace considered the question seriously, as she always did with Blake. "No," she said finally. "In Boston, I would have always been fighting for acceptance, always having to prove I was as good as male doctors. Here, I was needed too desperately for people to care about my gender. Here, I found you. Here, I built something that matters. This is where I was meant to be." Blake took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am glad, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "You will never have to," Grace promised. The next years brought the changes that come to every family as children grow into adults. Joey, at 22, married a rancher's daughter named Mary, a capable young woman who fit seamlessly into their family. Eleanor, at 20, left for medical school in Philadelphia, and Grace felt pride and sadness in equal measure watching her daughter embark on the path Grace herself had never been able to fully walk. The letters Eleanor sent were full of excitement and challenge, descriptions of her studies and the modern medical techniques she was learning. Grace devoured every word, living vicariously through her daughter's opportunities. When Eleanor graduated 4 years later and returned to Wallace with a medical degree, planning to join her mother's practice, Grace wept with joy. Together, they redesigned the practice, now officially calling it Holloway Medical Practice, offering a full range of services that combined Grace's herbal expertise with Eleanor's modern surgical training. Blake retired as sheriff at 50, handing the badge to Joey, and finally slowing down after decades of demanding work. He did not go idle, though, becoming more involved in town governance and territorial politics, using his influence to push for improvements in infrastructure and education. Grace continued working into her 50s, training the next generation of healers and enjoying collaborating with her daughter. She loved watching Eleanor work, seeing her skill and confidence, knowing that everything she had built would continue and grow beyond her own lifetime. Joey and Mary had children, 3 boys who called Grace and Blake grandparents and filled their home with noise and laughter. Blake was a doting grandfather, patient and playful in ways that reminded Grace of when their own children were small. They grew old together, Grace and Blake, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing but their minds sharp. They celebrated 30 years of marriage, then 35, then 40. Wallace continued to evolve around them, with automobiles and telephones arriving in the early years of the 20th century, but the core of what they had built remained. Grace finally retired at 62, handing the practice entirely over to Eleanor and a young male doctor Eleanor had married, both of them committed to carrying on the legacy. She did not stop healing entirely, still took on occasional patients and consultations, but for the first time in her adult life, she had time to simply be. Blake was delighted to have her full attention, and they spent their days in comfortable companionship. They traveled some, visiting Cheyenne and Denver, and even making one grand trip to San Francisco to see the ocean. But they always returned to Wallace, to the town that had become their home. They talked endlessly about their life together, reminiscing about the early days when Grace worked from a tent and Blake was just a deputy. They marveled at how far they had come, how much they had built together. "You remember when you told me there was a building on Main Street for me?" Grace asked one evening, the two of them sitting on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. "Of course I remember. Best decision I ever made. It changed my life," Grace said softly. "Not just the building, though that mattered. But you believing in me, seeing my potential, helping me succeed. You gave me everything, Blake." "We gave each other everything," Blake corrected gently. "I was just a lonely lawman with a hard job before you. You made my life worth living, Grace. Every day with you has been a gift." Grace reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of decades of practice. "I love you. Still, always, forever." "I love you too," Blake said. "To the end of time." They sat in peaceful silence as the sun set over Wallace, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Grace thought about the young woman she had been, running an apothecary from a tent, desperately trying to prove herself. She thought about the cowboy who had walked into her life and offered her not just a building but a future. She thought about their children and grandchildren, the practice they had built, the lives they had saved, the community they had served. It had been a good life, she thought. No, more than good. It had been extraordinary. Blake squeezed her hand gently, and Grace squeezed back, grateful for this man who had loved her through everything, who had been her partner in every sense of the word. They had built something beautiful together, a legacy of healing and justice and love that would outlast them both. As the stars began to appear overhead and the lights of Wallace twinkled below, Grace leaned her head on Blake's shoulder and smiled. This was home. This was happiness. This was everything she had never known she was searching for, all those years ago when she first arrived in Wyoming with nothing but her skills and her determination. She had come west looking for a place to practice medicine. She had found that, and so much more. She had found purpose, respect, community. She had found a partner who saw her as an equal and loved her as she was. She had found children and grandchildren, a family that extended far beyond blood. Most of all, she had found love. True, deep, lasting love that had sustained her through every challenge and amplified every joy. The kind of love that built lives and changed worlds, one small act of kindness at a time. Blake had told her there was a building on Main Street for her, and in doing so had offered her a future she could never have imagined. Grace had taken that offer and built a life beyond her wildest dreams. And as they sat together watching night fall over Wallace, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had created together, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of their journey. Their love story had started with a tent and a cowboy's offer. It had grown into something magnificent, a testament to what two people could build when they truly saw each other, supported each other, and loved each other without reservation. Years later, when Grace was 75 and Blake 77, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a great-grandchild that had arrived just weeks before. The party was held in the town hall, and half of Wallace attended, raising glasses to the couple who had given so much to their community. Joey gave a speech about his parents' legacy, about how they had built not just a medical practice and a career in law enforcement, but a model for what a partnership could be. Eleanor spoke about her mother's groundbreaking work as a healer and her father's unwavering support. The grandchildren presented them with a leather-bound book they had assembled, full of stories and photos documenting 50 years of life together. Grace and Blake stood together in front of everyone who mattered to them, holding hands as they had done for 5 decades, and Grace felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice strong despite her age. "Thank you for sharing this journey with us, for accepting me all those years ago when I was just a woman with a tent and a dream, for becoming our family and our home. Blake and I have been blessed beyond measure, and so much of that blessing comes from this community." Blake pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. They danced together that night, slowly and carefully but with joy, Blake murmuring in her ear about how beautiful she still was, Grace laughing and telling him he was sentimental in his old age. "I have always been sentimental about you," Blake countered. "From the moment I walked into that tent and saw you crushing herbs with purple-stained fingers, I was lost." "We found each other," Grace corrected, "and that made all the difference." They lived several more peaceful years together, each day a gift they did not take for granted. They watched their grandchildren grow, welcomed more great-grandchildren, saw Wallace continue to modernize while holding on to the values that had always defined it. Blake passed first, quietly in his sleep at 80 years old, Grace beside him as she had been for 53 years of marriage. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and though her heart broke, there was peace too. They had had a lifetime together, longer than many couples dreamed of, and every day had been precious. Grace lived 2 more years after Blake died, still sharp-minded and engaged with her family and community, though she admitted to Alina that she missed her husband every moment. "We were together so long, I barely remember who I was without him," she said. "Half of my soul went with him when he died." But she lived fully in those remaining years, documenting her knowledge for future healers, writing down stories of the old days for her grandchildren, making sure everyone knew how much she loved them. When Grace herself passed at 82, peacefully in her sleep just as Blake had, the whole town mourned. Her funeral was the largest Wallace had ever seen, people traveling from across Wyoming to pay respects to the healer who had saved so many lives. She was buried next to Blake in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Wallace, their headstones side by side under the open sky. The inscription on Grace's stone read, "Grace Sutton Holloway, beloved wife, mother, healer. She ran an apothecary from a tent, then changed a town." And on Blake's, Blake Holloway, devoted husband, father, sheriff. He told her there was a building on Main Street, then built a life with her. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit those graves for generations, bringing flowers and telling stories about the couple who had loved so deeply and built so much. The medical practice Alina ran continued to thrive, serving Wallace well into the 21st century. The sheriff's office still held records of Blake's cases, his fair and effective approach to law enforcement studied as a model. But more than any institution or building, Grace and Blake's true legacy was the love they had shared, and the way they had shown an entire community what partnership could look like. They had taken a chance on each other, a tent-bound healer and a cowboy deputy, and created something that transcended their individual ambitions. Their story became legend in Wallace, told and retold with each generation. How Grace had arrived with nothing but her skills and determination. How Blake had seen her worth when others doubted. How he had offered her a building on Main Street, and in doing so offered her a future. How she had accepted and built something extraordinary. How they had fallen in love working side by side. How they had married and raised children and served their community for over half a century. It was a love story for the ages, romantic and real, full of grand gestures and quiet moments, dramatic rescues and everyday support. It was proof that true partnership could transform lives, that seeing someone and believing in them could change everything, that love built on respect and shared purpose could last a lifetime. And though Grace and Blake were gone, their story lived on, inspiring new generations to be bold, to support each other, to build lives of purpose and meaning. Every time someone walked down Main Street and passed the building that had once housed Grace's Apothecary, they remembered the healer who had run it and the sheriff who had loved her. Every time couples in Wallace got married, they hoped their partnership would be as strong as the Holloways. Every time someone needed healing, they went to the practice Grace had founded. Every time justice needed to be served, the sheriff drew on Blake's example. Grace and Blake had built something that lasted, something that mattered. They had taken a moment, a simple offer of a building on Main Street, and turned it into a lifetime of love, service, and legacy. Their story was one of courage and kindness, of seeing potential and nurturing it, of two souls finding each other against the odds and choosing each other every day for 53 years. It was a story of the Wild West, of frontier medicine and frontier justice, of building civilization one act of care at a time. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and true and strong enough to change the world, at least their corner of it. And in the end, that was everything they had hoped to create. The tent may have been where Grace's journey in Wallace began, but the building on Main Street was where she found home. And the cowboy who offered it to her became the love of her life, her partner in every adventure, her constant through every change. Together they proved that the Wild West was not just a place of violence and chaos, but also of opportunity and transformation. That a woman could be a healer and be respected for it. That a lawman could be both strong and gentle. That love could flourish even in the harshest landscapes, growing deep roots that would sustain generations. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and grief and the passing of an era. But it also continued, living on in the lives they had touched and the institutions they had built and the love they had modeled. Grace Sutton had run an apothecary from a tent. Blake Holloway had told her there was a building on Main Street for her. And from that beginning had grown a love that changed everything, a partnership that defined what was possible, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To love deeply, to live fully, to leave the world a little better than they found it. Grace and Blake had done all three, and their story would be remembered and celebrated for as long as Wallace stood. The Wild West faded into history, but the love between the healer and the cowboy remained timeless, a reminder that the best stories are always about connection, about seeing each other truly, about building something beautiful together against all odds. Grace had come to Wyoming looking for a place to practice her craft. She had found that, yes, but so much more. She had found belonging, purpose, family, home. She had found Blake and he had found her, and together they had created something that would outlast them both. It was, in every sense, a love story for the ages. And it all started with a tent, a cowboy, and three simple words. There's a building for you. Those words had changed everything. They had opened a door to a future Grace could never have imagined. They had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life. And as their descendants gathered in Wallace generations later, still telling the story of Grace and Blake, still drawing inspiration from their example, it was clear that those three simple words had echoed far beyond that first moment. There's a building for you. Not just a physical structure, but a promise, a belief, an offer of partnership and possibility, A recognition that Grace belonged in the center of Wallace, not on its edges, that her work mattered, that she mattered. Blake had seen that truth before Grace herself fully believed it. He had offered her not just a building but validation, support, a chance to thrive. And in accepting, Grace had changed not just her own life but his and the lives of countless others. Their love story proved that the best gifts are often the simplest. Seeing someone, believing in them, helping them become who they were meant to be. Blake had done that for Grace, and Grace had done the same for him. And together they had built a life that was extraordinary in its love, its purpose, its impact. The tent was long gone, turned to dust and memory. The building on Main Street had changed hands many times, housed different businesses, been renovated and rebuilt. But the love between Grace Sutton and Blake Holloway remained as solid and real as the Wyoming earth itself, a foundation that had supported not just their own lives but the entire community of Wallace. And that was the true ending, the one that mattered most. Not death or time passing, but the legacy of love that endured, the ripples of kindness that spread ever outward, the proof that two people who truly saw each other could change the world. Grace had run an apothecary from a tent. Blake had told her there was a building on Main Street for her, and from that beginning had come everything. Love, family, purpose, belonging, a life well lived and a death well earned, surrounded by everyone and everything that mattered. It was a perfect ending to a perfect story, the kind of happily ever after that could only come from building something real and lasting with another person, day by day, year by year, through every joy and every sorrow, until death parted them and they became not two people but one legend, one story, one testament to the power of love. Grace and Blake Holloway, the healer and the sheriff, the woman with the tent and the man who offered her a building, two souls who found each other in the Wild West and created something beautiful that would last forever. Their story was complete, every thread woven to its conclusion, every question answered, every promise kept. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it, and that was everything.